There are moments in Scripture where God seems silent, moments where he delays, moments where he answers in ways we did not expect. But there is another kind of moment rarer, sharper, more terrifying, when God speaks clearly, and what he asks feels impossible. Abraham knew that moment. By the time we reach Genesis 22, Abraham is no longer the wandering man who left Ur not knowing where he was going. He has walked with God for decades. He has failed, stumbled, doubted, laughed at promises that seemed biologically absurd. He has tried to help God fulfill his word through Ishmael. He has waited through the long drought between promise and fulfillment. And finally, after years of barrenness, after hope almost expired, Isaac was born. Isaac was not merely a son, he was the embodiment of covenant. Every promise God had spoken about descendants, about nations, about blessing flowing to the ends of the earth, every word was now breathing in that boy. Isaac was proof that God keeps his word even when biology says otherwise. It was laughter returned to a tent that had known silence. And then one day, without warning, God speaks again. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him. There's no recorded argument from Abraham this time. No bargaining like when he interceded for Sodom. No laughter like when Sarah first heard the promise. The text moves with frightening simplicity. So Abraham rose early in the morning. Why no protest? Why no recorded resistance? The same man who once negotiated over the fate of a wicked city now walks silently toward a mountain with wood on a donkey and fire in his hand. Perhaps the silence says more than words ever could. Abraham had learned something in the years between promise and fulfillment. He had learned that God's word cannot fail. He had learned that delay is not denial. He had learned that human logic is a poor measuring stick for divine intention. But this request pierced deeper than delay. This was not about waiting. This was about surrendering the very fulfillment of the promise itself. If Isaac dies, the covenant dies, so it would seem. Here is where the test sharpens. God was not merely asking for obedience, he was asking Abraham to place the promise back into the hands of the promiser. Isaac had become tangible assurance. But assurance can subtly replace trust. When the promise becomes visible, the heart can begin to anchor itself in the gift rather than the giver. And so the journey begins. 3 days, 3 long days of walking with the unspoken weight pressing against Abraham's chest. Every step toward Moriah was a step away from natural understanding. Every glance at Isaac must have cut like a blade. The boy walks beside him unaware, carrying wood that foreshadows history yet unwritten. There is something almost unbearable in the tenderness of the scene. Isaac asks, "Where is the lamb?" Abraham answers, "God will provide." Was that hope? Was that prophecy? Was that faith speaking beyond understanding? The Hebrew phrasing carries layers. God will see for himself the lamb. In other words, provision belongs to God's vision, not Abraham's control. This is the kind of faith that terrifies modern sensibilities. We prefer faith that improves circumstances, not faith that walks into loss. We admire trust that leads to promotion, not trust that climbs an altar. But Genesis 22 strips faith of sentimentality. It asks a brutal question. If God asked for the very thing he promised you, would you still believe he is good? The mountain looms. Abraham tells the servants, "We will go, and we will come back." Not we. The New Testament later gives insight into Abraham's internal reasoning. Hebrews tells us he considered that God could raise the dead. This is staggering because resurrection had never been demonstrated in his lifetime. Abraham's faith had evolved beyond precedent. If God could create life from Sarah's barren womb, perhaps he could create life from death itself. This is not blind faith. It is faith built on history with God. Every altar Abraham had built before now prepared him for this altar. Every failure, every correction, every fulfillment was scaffolding for this moment. The climb up Moriah is slow in the text, deliberate. The narrative forces us to walk each step. Isaac carries wood. Abraham carries fire and knife. The roles are unmistakable. The son bears the burden. The father holds the instrument of sacrifice. And still, Abraham proceeds. It is crucial to understand that this test was not about cruelty. It was about allegiance. Ancient cultures were saturated with child sacrifice to appease angry gods. But here, the God of Abraham is not revealing a hunger for blood. He is revealing a demand for undivided trust. The difference becomes clear at the climax. The altar is built. The wood is arranged. Isaac is bound. The text does not describe struggle. Perhaps there was none. Perhaps the son trusted the father, the way the father trusted God. Silence hangs heavy over the mountain. The knife rises, and heaven speaks. Abraham. The repetition of his name carries urgency, intimacy, intervention. Do not lay your hand on the boy. The test was never meant to end in death. It was meant to expose the location of Abraham's ultimate trust. And in that suspended second, knife raised, heart surrendered to the truth became visible. God provides a ram caught in a thicket. Provision was waiting on the mountain all along. Abraham names the place the Lord will provide. Not the Lord explained, not the Lord clarified. Provide. This is the pivot point. Faith is not primarily about understanding the request. It is about trusting the character of the one who makes it. Abraham descended that mountain with Isaac alive, but something inside him had permanently shifted. The promise was no longer something he possessed. It was something he held loosely, and perhaps that is the deepest layer of the test. God was forming a father of nations, but nations cannot be birthed from a heart enslaved to visible security. The covenant required a man whose trust transcended even the miracle child. The shadow of this mountain stretches far beyond Genesis. Another father would one day walk another hill. Another son would carry wood. By that time, the knife would not be stayed. Provision would take a different form, but for now, Abraham descends with Isaac beside him, laughter restored, covenant intact, and trust refined through fire. The question lingers for every generation that reads this story. What is your Isaac? What promise have you wrapped your identity around? And if God asked for it not to destroy you, but to free you, would you rise early and walk toward the mountain? Faith that survives silence is strong, but faith that surrenders fulfillment itself that is unshakable. And Abraham's story is only beginning. The descent from Moriah was quieter than the ascent. The air had not changed. The stones beneath their feet were the same stones. The sky stretched with the same indifferent vastness, and yet everything was different. Abraham walked down that mountain with Isaac alive beside him, but he was not the same man who had climbed it. Something invisible had been cut at Isaac's life, but Abraham's attachment to control. The ram had burned on the altar in place of the son. Smoke rose where tragedy had nearly unfolded. The smell of sacrifice lingered in the folds of Abraham's garments as they made their way back to the servants when he had told them, "We will go and we will return." Perhaps even he did not fully understand the depth of that confession. Now the words had proven heavier than optimism. They had become testimony. But why this test? Why would God demand what he never intended to take? To understand this moment, we must look backward as much as forward. Abraham's journey with God had always involved separation. Leave your country, leave your father's household, walk away from the familiar. Each stage peeled away another layer of security. Ur had been his birthplace. Haran had been transitional safety. Even Lot, his nephew, had represented relational comfort. One by one, these attachments loosened. Isaac, however, was different. Isaac was not merely comfort, he was destiny. He was the visible embodiment of the covenant. Losing land is one thing, losing legacy is another. If Isaac were gone, the future promised in Genesis 12 would evaporate in an instant. God was not asking Abraham to surrender comfort. He was asking him to surrender the future. He believed he understood, and therein lies the deeper tension. Abraham had learned to trust God for provision. He had learned to trust him for protection. But now he was being asked to trust him with interpretation. Could he believe that God's promises were larger than the single path he assumed they required? When Isaac was born, the waiting ended. Decades of tension resolved in a cry from a newborn child. Sarah laughed not in disbelief this time, but in astonishment. Neighbors celebrated. The impossible had happened, but fulfilled promises can quietly shift from gifts into guarantees in the human heart. What begins as gratitude can harden into expectation. God will not share ultimate allegiance with even his own blessings. The mountain revealed what Abraham valued most, not because God lacked information, but because Abraham needed revelation about himself. Tests in Scripture rarely inform God. They expose the tested. In the ancient world, sacrifice was common language. Blood sealed covenants. Animals were offered to secure favor or forgiveness. But human sacrifice, though tragically present in surrounding cultures, was a distortion of worship. By intervening at the last second, God distinguished himself from pagan deities. He was not demanding appeasement through brutality. He was revealing that obedience must not cross into moral contradiction. The God who gives life does not delight in its destruction, yet the emotional weight remains staggering. Isaac was likely not a toddler in this story. Many scholars suggest he was a young man, strong enough to carry wood up a mountain. If so, the scene becomes even more profound. A father over 100 years old binds a son in the strength of youth. The only explanation is willing submission. Isaac trusted Abraham. Abraham trusted God. Trust stacked upon trust. Fragile yet resolute, the echo of that relational trust ripples forward through history. But before we rush to future parallels, we must sit in the tension of the present narrative. After the angel stops Abraham, a declaration follows. "Now I know that you fear God." The phrase is not about cognitive discovery. It is about demonstration. Faith that remains internal is invisible. Faith that acts becomes embodied. Obedience clarified allegiance. Then comes the reaffirmation of the covenant. "By myself I have sworn." The promise is restated with heightened intensity. Descendants as numerous as stars. Possession of gates of enemies. Blessing to all nations through his offspring. It is as if heaven underscores the covenant in bold ink immediately after the test. The surrender did not diminish the promise. It secured it. There is a paradox here that challenges every generation. What we cling to most tightly can become the very thing that restricts us. Abraham's willingness to release Isaac ensured he would not lose him. Had he refused, fear might have corrupted the relationship. By placing Isaac back in God's hands, Abraham received him anew not as possession, but as stewardship. This distinction matters. Possession breeds anxiety. Stewardship breeds gratitude. When we believe something is ours in an absolute sense, its potential loss terrifies us. But when we understand it as entrusted, we hold it differently. Abraham walked away from Moriah knowing Isaac belonged to God first. Yet life after the mountain did not immediately transform into uninterrupted serenity. Sarah's death in the following chapter reminds us that mortality still governed human experience. Abraham mourned deeply. He negotiated for a burial plot, insisting on ownership of a small piece of land in a territory not yet fully possessed. Even in grief, covenant language lingered. The promised land was still future. The stars were still mostly unseen. The test of Genesis 22 did not eliminate the need for ongoing trust. It simply deepened its foundation. One of the most overlooked aspects of the story is its geography. Moriah would later become Jerusalem. The same mountain range would eventually host a temple where countless lambs were sacrificed. The narrative plants a seed that would grow across centuries. The Lord will provide becomes more than Abraham's personal confession. It becomes prophetic geography. But Abraham could not see that horizon. He lived within partial revelation. His obedience operated without full narrative closure. This again highlights the nature of biblical faith. It moves forward without comprehensive maps. It trusts promises that stretch beyond a single lifetime. Imagine the conversations between Abraham and Isaac in the years that followed. Did Isaac ever ask, "Father, what would have happened if the angel had not spoken?" Did Abraham ever lie awake at night revisiting the sound of his name called from heaven? Trauma leaves echoes even when tragedy is averted. Yet within those echoes was a deeper assurance: God sees. The Hebrew name given there, YHWH, carries dual meaning. To see and to provide are intertwined. God sees the need and provides accordingly. Provision flows from divine perception. What Abraham could not see on the way up the mountain, a ram caught in a thicket, was already present. The solution preceded the crisis from heaven's vantage point. This reframes obedience entirely. We often assume that surrender leads into uncertainty without safety nets, but Genesis 22 suggests something radical. Provision is already woven into the path of obedience before we recognize the need for it. Abraham's faith did not manipulate God into responding. It aligned him with a provision already prepared. The story closes without dramatic fanfare. They return. Life continues. The covenant advances through ordinary events: marriages arranged, wells dug, disputes navigated. But beneath the surface, Abraham carries an unshakable conviction. If God asks for everything, he remains faithful with everything. The test on Moriah was not the end of Abraham's journey. It was the refining of its core. And refinement always involves fire. The question that rises from this chapter is deeply personal and endlessly relevant. What is the promise you fear losing? What gift has become central to your sense of security? Faith does not demand emotional numbness. Abraham felt the weight. He walked 3 days under its shadow, but he refused to let fear redefine God's character. The mountain stands in Scripture not as a monument to near tragedy, but as a testimony to surrendered trust. And still, the deeper implications are unfolding. Because the story of a father and a son on a mountain is not finished. It is only foreshadowed. Time moved forward after Moriah, but the mountain never truly faded into the background of Abraham's life. Some encounters with God become reference points so permanent that every later decision is filtered through them. For Abraham, Genesis 22 was not simply a dramatic episode. It was a recalibration of his entire spiritual posture. Before Moriah, he believed God. After Moriah, he trusted him with anything. Yet the days that followed were not marked by constant supernatural interruption. There were no daily angelic visitations, no repeated voices from heaven. Instead, life resumed its steady rhythm. Livestock needed tending. Servants required oversight. Family relationships continued to unfold with all their complexity. Covenant faith did not eliminate ordinary responsibility. It infused it with deeper confidence. Soon after Sarah died, her death is recorded with startling simplicity. The woman who had laughed at the promise, who had carried the miracle child in her aged body, who had journeyed through decades of uncertainty beside Abraham, was suddenly gone. Scripture tells us Abraham mourned and wept for her. That brief description holds immense weight. The man who had nearly surrendered his son now faced the loss of his wife. And here we see something profound. Faith does not shield from grief. Abraham did not say, "God has promised descendants, therefore I feel no sorrow." He wept. Covenant does not cancel human pain, it sustains the heart beneath it. The same man who climbed Moriah in obedience now bowed in mourning beside Sarah's body. But even in grief, faith influenced action. Abraham insisted on purchasing a burial site. He refused to accept it as a gift from the Hittites. Why? Because ownership mattered. The promised land was still largely possessed by others, yet Abraham secured a foothold, one small cave in Machpelah. It was a grave, but it was also a down payment on promise. This is how covenant operates across generations. It anchors itself in tangible acts, even when full fulfillment remains distant. Abraham buried Sarah in land he did not yet fully control, believing that one day his descendants would inherit it completely. The cave became more than a tomb. It became testimony. There is a subtle but powerful connection between Moriah and Machpelah. On one mountain, Abraham surrendered the future. In one cave, he secured it. The willingness to give Isaac back to God freed him to claim ground without fear. Loss no longer controlled him. Even death could not nullify promise. As Isaac matured, Abraham's role shifted. The father who once led now prepared to release leadership to the next generation. Covenant was never about a single lifespan, it was about continuity. Isaac needed a wife, someone through whom the promise could extend. Once again, Abraham faced uncertainty. The land was unfamiliar, the surrounding culture spiritually incompatible with the covenant calling. So he sent his servant back toward his homeland, not to return permanently, but to find a wife among his kin. The decision is strategic and spiritual. Abraham would not allow Isaac to return to Mesopotamia. The promise pointed forward, not backward. Faith refuses regression. This moment reveals something crucial about obedience. Surrender does not create passivity. Abraham did not say, "God will provide, therefore I will do nothing." He prayed, planned, delegated, and trusted. Faith operates with responsibility, not resignation. The servant's journey, the meeting with Rebekah, the providential details of the well all unfold as quiet confirmations that the God who provided a ram also orchestrates meetings at wells. Divine provision is not limited to dramatic rescue. It extends into relational alignment, timing, and seemingly ordinary encounters. When Rebekah agreed to leave her family and journey toward a man she had never met, the covenant expanded once more. Isaac met her in the field at evening. Scripture says he loved her. That brief statement carries healing undertones. He was comforted after his mother's death. Life moves through grief, not around it. Notice the pattern emerging: surrender, loss, provision, continuation. Abraham's story refuses to flatten faith into a single emotional note. It contains ecstasy and anguish, laughter and tears, mountain peaks and burial caves. Yet through all of it runs a singular thread: God's promise remains steady even when circumstances fluctuate violently. By now Abraham was old, described as advanced in years. The phrase echoes intentionally. The man who once doubted how a child could come from an aged body now stands as living evidence that divine timing transcends biological probability. His very existence as a father of nations is miracle layered upon miracle. And still, his journey is not yet complete. One of the most overlooked yet revealing aspects of Abraham's later life is that he continues to father children after Sarah's death. Through Keturah, more sons are born. Yet Scripture distinguishes Isaac as the child of promise. Abraham provides for the others but sends them away from Isaac. This is not favoritism born of emotion, it is covenant clarity. Not every blessing carries the same assignment. Discernment deepens with maturity. Abraham had learned the danger of attempting to manufacture promise. As with Ishmael, now he acts decisively to protect the covenant line. Faith must sometimes separate in order to preserve calling. As his strength waned, Abraham faced the inevitable horizon of mortality. The man who had once been asked to surrender his son now prepared to surrender himself to time, yet death no longer carried the same terror it might have before Moriah. If God could provide on the mountain, he could remain faithful beyond the grave. Scripture records that Abraham died old and full of years. The phrase is gentle. It does not suggest absence of hardship, it suggests completion. A life stretched across decades of wandering, waiting, and testing came to rest. Isaac and Ishmael buried him together. There is quiet redemption in that detail. The two sons, one born of human striving, one of divine promise, stand side by side at their father's grave. Division does not have the final word. Even flawed chapters in Abraham's story are woven into a larger narrative of continuity. But the covenant did not end at the burial cave. It moved forward into Isaac, then Jacob, then generations yet unborn. The stars Abraham once tried to count remained beyond calculation. When we step back from part 3 of this journey, we see something clearer than at the beginning. Faith is not a single act of obedience on a mountain. It is a lifelong alignment with a promise that outlives you. It is the courage to bury your dead in land you do not yet possess fully. It is the wisdom to send your son forward rather than backward. It is the humility to know you will not see the entire fulfillment with your own eyes. Abraham never witnessed a nation as numerous as the stars. He never saw kings emerge from his line in fullness. He never saw the global reach of the blessing promised in Genesis 12. Yet he lived as though it was certain. The test of Moriah was dramatic, but the endurance afterward was just as significant. Anyone can respond to a crisis. Few can walk steadily for decades after the crisis passes. And so the story continues, not merely as ancient history, but as a template. What does it mean to trust beyond explanation? What does it mean to surrender without guarantees? What does it mean to anchor identity in promise rather than possession? Abraham's life whispers an answer. Trust the promiser more than the path. Walk forward even when the horizon is incomplete. And when the mountain asks for everything, remember, provision may already be waiting in the thicket. As Abraham's life receded into memory and Isaac stepped fully into the foreground, the covenant entered a quieter phase. The drama of departure from the firelit skies above altars in unfamiliar lands. The knife raised on Moriah, these moments belonged to Abraham. Isaac's story unfolds differently. There are fewer recorded divine speeches, fewer dramatic relocations, and yet the promise remains intact, moving forward not through spectacle, but through continuity. This shift is significant. Faith is often forged in crisis, but it is sustained in repetition. Isaac inherited not only land and livestock, but history. He inherited stories of stars counted in the dark, of laughter in old age, of a ram caught in a thicket. He grew up knowing he had once lain bound upon wood while his father raised a blade. That knowledge alone must have shaped his inner world in ways Scripture does not fully describe. To live as the child of promise is its own kind of burden. God appeared to Isaac during a famine, echoing words once spoken to Abraham, "Stay in this land, I will be with you and bless you." The instruction mirrored the past but required fresh obedience. Isaac could not simply replay his father's journey. He had to respond in his own moment. Covenant does not eliminate personal choice, it intensifies it. The famine created pressure. Scarcity always does. Survival instincts tempt migration, compromise, shortcuts. Abraham had once gone to Egypt during famine, leading to deception and relational fracture. Isaac faced a similar tension. Would he repeat inherited mistakes, or trust the sustaining promise within present difficulty? He stayed. That single act remaining where provision seemed uncertain reveals the generational transfer of trust. The son absorbed lessons from the father's mountains and valleys. Faith, when modeled authentically, imprints itself. Yet Isaac was not flawless. In Gerar, he repeated Abraham's fear-driven deception, claiming Rebekah was his sister. The pattern resurfaced. Covenant identity does not erase human weakness. The echo of past failure reminds us that promise moves through imperfect vessels. Still, God protected Rebekah. The king confronted Isaac, but disaster was averted. Once again, divine faithfulness outpaced human frailty. This is a recurring theme. The covenant survives not because its carriers are flawless, but because its author is faithful. Isaac prospered in that land despite opposition. Wells became symbols of tension and perseverance. Servants dug, enemies filled them with dirt. Again and again, water sources were contested. Each well carried a name reflecting conflict. Sitna. Finally, a well without dispute, Rehoboth. Now the Lord has made room for us. The well imagery deepens the narrative. Water in a desert determines survival. To dig is to hope. To redig ancestral wells is to reconnect with legacy. Isaac's persistence at the wells mirrors Abraham's persistence in waiting. Both required patience under pressure. Eventually, God reaffirmed the covenant directly to Isaac. Descendants multiplied, blessing extended for Abraham's sake. The promise was not diluted by transition, it was strengthened. And yet, within Isaac's household, new tension brewed. Rebekah conceived twins after years of barrenness, another echo of Sarah's story. Even in conception, struggle to find their existence. Two nations are in your womb. The rivalry began before birth. Esau emerged first, red and rugged. Jacob followed, grasping his brother's heel. Names became prophetic trajectories. Here, the covenant line narrows again. The younger would serve the elder on inversion of cultural norm. Divine choice disrupts human hierarchy. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah favored Jacob. Division entered the family structure. This is where generational faith faces its most subtle threat, not external famine but internal fracture. The same promise that unified Abraham now risked being manipulated by parental favoritism. Isaac aged, his eyesight dimmed. Physical blindness foreshadowed relational misjudgment. When he sought to bless Esau, believing him to be the chosen heir, deception once again shaped the household's destiny. Rebekah orchestrated a plan. Jacob disguised himself. Isaac, uncertain but persuaded, spoke the blessing over the younger son. The moment is thick with irony. The covenant moves forward through intrigue rather than clarity. Jacob receives words intended for Esau. Isaac trembles violently upon discovering the deception, yet he does not revoke the blessing. Why? Because even in confusion, he recognizes something larger at work. The oracle spoken before the twins' birth resurfaces in his awareness. Divine intention overrides human orchestration. Still, consequences ripple outward. Esau's fury forces Jacob into exile. Rebekah loses daily proximity to her favorite son. Isaac lives long enough to see fracture within his household. This is where Abraham's legacy meets reality. Covenant does not guarantee harmony, it guarantees purpose. The path toward fulfillment weaves through jealousy, deception, and separation. As Isaac approaches the end of his days, he stands between memory and future. He remembers the mountain where his father nearly surrendered him. He remembers wells dug and redig. He now watches his own sons struggle for identity and blessing. What does it mean to pass faith forward when the next generation wrestles differently? Isaac's life suggests that continuity does not require identical experience. His walk with God was quieter than Abraham's. Fewer recorded altars, fewer dramatic tests. But quiet obedience sustains as surely as dramatic surrender. Abraham's test was public in Scripture's memory. Isaac's tests were domestic within marriage, within famine, within fatherhood. Both mattered. And as the covenant line continues through Jacob, we begin to see that the promise was never about perfect families. It was about a faithful God shaping flawed lineages into vessels of redemption. The God who provided on Moriah now provides in deserts and family tensions. He works through blindness and insight alike. The promise survives deception not because deception is righteous, but because divine purpose is relentless. By the close of Isaac's era, one truth stands firm. What God begins, he sustains across generations. The stars promised to Abraham are still distant, but they are closer than before. The land purchased as burial ground remains partially possessed, but inheritance moves incrementally forward. Faith in part 4 is less dramatic, more enduring. It is the kind that digs wells repeatedly, the kind that weeps over family fracture yet continues blessing, the kind that trusts God's larger narrative even when personal chapters feel unresolved. And as Jacob flees toward an uncertain future, the covenant enters another transformation. The God of Abraham and Isaac will soon reveal himself again not merely as the God of fathers, but as the God who meets fugitives in the dark. The story is widening. Jacob ran with the blessing on his lips and guilt in his chest. The desert stretched before him, wide and indifferent, as though creation itself refused to take sides in the conflict he had ignited. Behind him lay Esau's fury and his father's trembling realization. Before him lay uncertainty. The covenant promise moved forward, but it moved through exile. It is important to feel the weight of that word. Exile was not merely relocation, it was rupture. Jacob left home not in triumph but in fear. He carried the birthright and blessing, yet he slept under open skies with a stone for a pillow. This is how the covenant often advances, not through comfort, but through displacement. Night fell somewhere between Beersheba and Haran. Exhaustion overtook him. There were no tents of familiarity, no servants to attend him, no mother whispering strategy. Just rock beneath his head and stars above stars once pointed out to Abraham as symbols of promise. Jacob had grown up under those stories. Now he lay alone beneath their silent brilliance. And then he dreamed. A ladder, more accurately. A stairway set upon the earth, its top reaching into heaven. Angels ascending and descending. Movement between realms. Traffic between seen and unseen. And above it stood the Lord. The imagery is striking. Abraham had built altars reaching upward in worship. Now Jacob sees heaven reaching downward in initiative. The covenant is not sustained by human climbing. It is maintained by divine descent. The voice speaks words already familiar in structure. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. Your descendants shall be like the dust of the earth. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. The promise is reiterated, not diminished by deception. God does not revoke covenant because of Jacob's cunning. But notice the addition. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. Presence becomes the anchor. Jacob awakens in fear, not comfort. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. The fugitive discovers something transformative. Exile does not equal abandonment. Heaven's staircase does not require a sanctuary. It appears in wilderness. He names the place Bethel, house of God. The man who manipulated blessing now stands trembling before unearned grace. He sets up the stone as a pillar, pours oil upon it, and makes a vow. His vow is still transactional in tone. If God will be with me, then the Lord shall be my God. Faith has begun, but maturity is still unfolding. The journey continues toward Haran, where Jacob encounters his uncle Laban. If Jacob believed himself skilled in strategy, he met his match. The deceiver finds himself deceived. He falls in love with Rachel, works 7 years for her hand, only to be given Leah under cover of darkness. The irony is impossible to ignore. The man who disguised himself to steal blessing now experiences misidentification in marriage. The years that follow are complex, layered with rivalry between sisters, competition for affection, children born through longing and negotiation. 12 sons emerge from this tangled web. The nation promised to Abraham begins to take human shape through relational strain. Laban changes Jacob's wages repeatedly. Tension builds, flocks multiply under Jacob's management, but suspicion grows. Prosperity and hostility coexist. This is covenant in contested territory. Through it all, God remains present, not always speaking, but guiding outcomes. Jacob prospers despite manipulation. He grows wealthy in livestock, servants, family. Yet wealth does not erase restlessness. 2 decades pass before God instructs him to return to the land of his fathers. Return means confrontation. Esau still lives in that land. The memory of threat remains unresolved. Jacob sends messengers ahead, only to learn Esau approaches with 400 men. Fear reawakens instantly. Blessing has not erased consequence. Jacob divides his camp strategically, prepares gifts extravagantly, prays desperately. His prayer is telling. He appeals to covenant promise while confessing unworthiness. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother. This is not the self-assured manipulator of earlier chapters. This is a man aware of vulnerability. And then comes the night by the river. Jacob sends his family across. He remains alone. Alone once more, like the night at Bethel. But this encounter will not be a dream. A man wrestles with him until daybreak. No introduction, no explanation, just struggle in darkness. The physicality of the scene matters. Faith is not only intellectual assent, it can become bodily resistance, persistence, clinging. The wrestling continues for hours. At some point Jacob realizes this opponent is no mere man. When the stranger touches his hip and dislocates it, power disparity becomes evident. Yet Jacob refuses to release his grip. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." There is something paradoxical here. The man who once stole blessing now demands it directly from the source. He no longer relies on disguise. He clings openly. "What is your name?" the stranger asks. The question echoes identity. Jacob means heel grabber, supplanter, the one who grasps and trips. To state his name aloud is to admit history. The reply comes with transformation. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Prevailing here does not mean overpowering. It means enduring, clinging, remaining engaged until dawn breaks. Jacob leaves that place limping. The limp is not weakness. It is mark. He has encountered God not only in dream but in struggle. The covenant shifts from inherited identity to personal encounter. The God of Abraham and Isaac becomes his God in a new dimension. When morning arrives, Esau approaches. Instead of violence, reconciliation unfolds. Esau runs to embrace him. Tears replace swords. The feared confrontation dissolves into unexpected grace. The gifts Jacob prepared become expressions of humility rather than bribes for survival. The sequence matters. Wrestling precedes reconciliation. Identity change precedes relational healing. Jacob, now Israel, returns to the land promised to his grandfather. The covenant has crossed exile, deception, rivalry, and wrestling. It has endured human flaw without collapsing. Reveals a vital truth. Promise does not eliminate struggle. It transforms it. Jacob's life is messy, uneven, morally complicated. Yet through it all, God remains committed to the words spoken under starlit skies generations earlier. The man who once grasped heels now limps forward under a new name. And through his son's imperfect rivalrous, distinct the shape of a nation begins to emerge. The story is no longer about a single patriarch. It is expanding into tribes, into history, into destiny that will one day confront famine, slavery, and deliverance. But that is yet to unfold. For now, Israel walks with a limp, bearing blessing not as stolen treasure, but as hard-won identity. Israel returned to the land with a new name and a permanent limp, but transformation does not erase complexity. The covenant promise now pulsed through 12 sons, 12 distinct temperaments, ambitions, insecurities. A nation was taking shape within a single household, and like all households, it carried fracture lines beneath the surface. The favored son emerged early. Joseph was born to Rachel, the long-loved wife whose barrenness had once echoed Sarah's. His arrival felt like personal vindication to Rachel and emotional fulfillment to Jacob. The boy carried not only paternal affection but symbolic weight. He was the firstborn of the beloved. In subtle ways, preference shaped the atmosphere of the family long before open conflict ignited. Scripture describes a robe richly ornamented, distinct. Whether it was multicolored or simply elaborately tailored matters less than what it represented. Distinction, visibility, favor. In a household already layered with rivalry between mothers, such visible preference became combustible material. Joseph dreamed in his dreams. Sheaves bowed to his sheaf. Sun, moon, and 11 stars bent in submission. The imagery was unmistakable. Authority, elevation, dominion, and Joseph, still young, narrated the dreams openly. Whether from innocence or immaturity, he did not conceal their implications. His brother's resentment intensified. Even Jacob rebuked him outwardly, though he kept the saying in mind. The pattern established in previous generations resurfaced divine choice, disrupting natural order. Just as Jacob had been chosen over Esau, now Joseph's dreams positioned him above older brothers. But there is a difference between promise spoken and promise fulfilled. The distance between the two often contains darkness. One day Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers in the fields near Shechem. It is a small detail but significant. The favored son approaches those who resent him. The coat makes him visible from afar. "Here comes this dreamer," they say. The tone carries contempt. The plan forms quickly. Kill him, throw him into a pit, see what becomes of his dreams. Violence is halted only partially by Reuben's intervention. Instead of bloodshed, they strip him of the robe, the symbol of favor, and cast him into an empty cistern. The imagery is stark. The dreamer descends into darkness. A favored son tastes abandonment. Heaven, which once seemed to speak through dreams, is silent. Soon opportunity arises in the form of passing traders. Joseph is sold for silver. Profit replaces murder. He is carried away toward Egypt while his brothers dip the robe in blood and prepare deception for their father. When Jacob sees the torn garment, grief returns with full force. The man who once feared losing Rachel now believes he has lost her son. The covenant line fractures under sorrow again. Israel weeps for Joseph, refusing comfort. Meanwhile, Joseph descends into Egypt, a foreign land, far from altars built by Abraham. This is exile in its rawest form. Not self-chosen, not strategic, but forced. Yet the narrative shifts with a quiet refrain. The Lord was with Joseph. Presence again becomes the anchor. In Potiphar's house, Joseph prospers. Integrity marks his service. Trust is earned. Responsibility increases. The dreamer becomes steward in captivity. Favor manifests not as comfort but as competence under constraint. But even there, temptation tests him. Potiphar's wife seeks him persistently. Power, isolation, youth, ingredients ripe for compromise. Yet Joseph resists with clarity. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Notice the language. His loyalty transcends circumstance. Though far from QAnon, far from family narratives, he recognizes divine presence. Refusal costs him. Accusation replaces advancement. Prison follows promotion. Once again, descent. This pattern repeats with almost relentless rhythm. Promise, descent, favor, accusation, hope, confinement. The reader feels tension sharpen. If Joseph's dreams were from God, why does each chapter move downward? In prison, the refrain returns. The Lord was with him, even within confinement. Joseph rises to administrative responsibility. He interprets dreams for Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, accurately foretelling restoration for one and execution for the other. Before the cupbearer departs, Joseph pleads to be remembered. He is forgotten. 2 full years pass in silence. This may be one of the most brutal stretches in the narrative. Betrayed by brothers, falsely accused, now overlooked by the one man who could advocate for him. Heaven appears inactive. Dreams that once elevated him now mock him. The pit, the prison, the waiting, each seems to contradict promise. But timing in covenant history operates differently from human urgency. Pharaoh dreams disturbing visions, cows devouring cows, ears of grain swallowing others. None can interpret. Suddenly the cupbearer remembers Joseph. Memory, delayed but not erased, becomes gateway. Joseph is summoned abruptly from prison. Shaved, changed, presented before Pharaoh. The shift is dramatic. From dungeon to palace in a single day. When Pharaoh describes the dreams, Joseph's response reveals matured theology. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Years of silence have not diminished his conviction about divine sovereignty. They have refined it. Interpretation follows 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph not only interprets, he proposes strategy, storage during plenty to survive scarcity. Pharaoh recognizes wisdom beyond ordinary skill. Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Joseph is elevated to second in command over Egypt. Consider the arc. The brothers' jealousy led to slavery. Slavery led to service. Service led to prison. Prison led to palace. None of those stages felt like fulfillment when experienced. Each appeared to negate the dream, but each positioned Joseph precisely where future preservation required him to be. The famine arrives, stretching beyond Egypt into surrounding lands including Canaan. Jacob sent sons to buy grain. They bow before the governor of Egypt, not recognizing the brother they sold. Dreams once mocked now stand embodied in reality. Joseph recognizes them. They do not recognize him. This is a sacred moment of testing, not for Joseph, but for his brothers. Power rests now in the hands of the one betrayed. Revenge would be easy, justifiable by human logic. But Joseph does not rush judgment. He orchestrates a series of interactions designed to reveal their hearts. Accusations of spying, Simeon detained, Benjamin demanded. The tension crescendos when Benjamin, the other son of Rachel, is brought before him. Joseph sees the youngest brother, the one who replaced him in their father's visible affection. Emotion overwhelms him repeatedly. He weeps in private chambers. Finally, in a moment thick with revelation, Judah offers himself as substitute for Benjamin, pleading for their father's sake. The same Judah who once suggested selling Joseph now offers personal sacrifice to prevent further grief. Transformation has occurred. Joseph can no longer restrain himself. He reveals his identity. The brothers are dismayed, fearful of retaliation. But Joseph speaks words that reshape the entire narrative. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive. Here, covenant perspective becomes explicit. Human intention operated, yes, but divine intention operated simultaneously, overriding destruction with preservation. Joseph does not minimize betrayal. He reframes it within sovereignty. Jacob and the entire household relocate to Egypt during famine. What began as exile for one becomes refuge for many. The pit becomes pathway, the prison becomes preparation. Part 6 exposes the architecture of providence in motion. Promise is not linear. It bends through injustice and forgetfulness. It allows descent so that elevation serves more than personal vindication, it serves preservation of nations. Joseph's life answers a critical question left hanging since Abraham. What if obedience leads not to immediate blessing, but to prolonged suffering? The answer unfolds quietly. God's purposes extend beyond individual comfort into generational survival. The covenant now rests in Egypt, awaiting another transformation. Famine will pass, favor will fade, and a new chapter of bondage will begin. But for now, the dreamer stands in authority. Proof that silence does not equal absence, and delay does not cancel design. The years of famine eventually loosened their grip, but Egypt did not forget Joseph, at least not immediately. Under his governance, the nation survived catastrophe. Grain had been stored, distribution managed, economies restructured. Pharaoh entrusted him fully. Israel's family settled in Goshen, fertile and distinct. What began as refuge took root as residence. Jacob, now aged and leaning on his staff, blessed Joseph's sons before his death. Even there, the pattern of inversion surfaced again. Ephraim elevated above Manasseh, crossed hands, unexpected priority. The covenant line continued to defy predictable order. When Jacob died, grief filled the household once more. Joseph wept openly upon his father's face. The journey that began with a stolen blessing ended with a nation forming under layered promises. Before Joseph's death, his brothers trembled again, fearing revenge once their father's protective presence was gone. Joseph reassured them, repeating the theological anchor of his life. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." He saw history not as isolated acts, but as intersecting intentions. Human freedom and divine sovereignty coexisted without canceling one another. Then Joseph died. The man whose wisdom had preserved Egypt was embalmed and placed in a coffin, not yet buried in Canaan. He made his brothers swear to carry his bones back when God would eventually visit them. Even in death, his gaze stretched forward. Egypt was not the destination. It was an interval. Generations passed. A new pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. Memory can be fragile in political systems. Gratitude erodes when leadership changes. What had once been alliance became suspicion. The Israelites multiplied. What had been blessing in Goshen now appeared threat to a ruler concerned with national security. Oppression began, subtly forced labor, harsh conditions. The narrative shifts tone. The covenant family becomes a labor force. The sons of Israel who once managed resources now mix clay and straw under surveillance. And yet, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. The promise spoken to Abraham's descendants like stars, like dust, continued to expand even under bondage. Covenant life does not require favorable political climate. It expands in tension as often as in prosperity. Fear drove Pharaoh to escalate cruelty. Hebrew midwives were commanded to kill newborn boys. They refused, fearing God more than decree. Civil disobedience became quiet resistance rooted in reverence. When that strategy failed to reduce growth, Pharaoh ordered all male infants thrown into the Nile. The river once associated with Egypt's life became instrument of death. Into this atmosphere a child was born hidden for 3 months by a mother who refused surrender. When concealment became impossible, she placed him in a basket coated with pitch and set him among the reeds of the Nile. The irony is unmistakable. The decree intended to drown Hebrew sons becomes the very mechanism by which one is preserved. Pharaoh's daughter discovers the child, moved with compassion. The oppressor's household unknowingly shelters the future liberator. The boy is named Moses, drawn out. Once again, divine providence operates beneath visible events. A basket becomes ark, a river becomes pathway, adoption becomes preparation. Moses grows in Egyptian court culture, educated, positioned, aware of both privilege and heritage. At some point, the reality of his identity presses into his conscience. Seeing a Hebrew beaten by an Egyptian, he intervenes violently, killing the aggressor. The next day, when he attempts mediation between Hebrews, they respond with suspicion. "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" The question pierces deeper than accusation. It foreshadows his calling and exposes premature action. Moses flees into Midian, becoming shepherd rather than prince. Once again, deliverance moves through exile. 40 years pass in obscurity. Shepherding in desert silence shapes him more deeply than palace education. Leadership for a stubborn nation will require patience, endurance, and familiarity with wilderness terrain. The delay is not wasted, it is formation. Then comes the burning bush. On Horeb, Moses sees a bush ablaze yet not consumed. He turns aside a critical detail. Curiosity leads to encounter. God calls his name from the fire, echoing past callings: Abraham, Jacob, now Moses. The ground is holy, not because geography changed permanently, but because presence manifested. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob declares awareness. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their sufferings." After centuries, heaven speaks again. Moses is commissioned to confront Pharaoh. His objections surface immediately. "Who am I? What is your name? What if they do not believe me? I am slow of speech." The pattern is familiar. Calling meets insecurity. God responds not by inflating Moses' self-confidence, but by anchoring him in divine identity. "I am who I am." The covenant name surfaces as assurance. Presence remains the central promise. "I will be with you." The same presence that appeared at Bethel, that accompanied Joseph in prison, now ignites in flame before a shepherd. Moses returns to Egypt reluctantly yet obediently. Signs confront Pharaoh: staff to serpent, water to blood, plagues escalating in severity. The narrative becomes confrontation between sovereignty and stubbornness. Pharaoh's heart hardens repeatedly, sometimes by his own resolve, sometimes described as hardened by God. Complexity persists. Human will and divine purpose interweave. The plagues dismantle Egypt's illusions of controlled darkness over sun worship. Blood in sacred river, livestock dying, hail falling, firstborn threatened. Each act declares that the God of Israel is not regional, not limited, not symbolic. Finally comes the night of Passover, a lamb slain, blood on doorposts, death passes over marked homes. The imagery echoes more a substitution, provision, preservation through sacrifice. Deliverance requires sign of covenant. At midnight, a cry rises throughout Egypt. Pharaoh yields. Israel departs not as escaped slaves, but as a multitude carrying borrowed silver and gold. What began in oppression transitions into exodus. Yet freedom does not remove fear instantly. When Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues them to the Red Sea, panic erupts. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt? Generational memory is fragile. Even after plagues, even after Passover, fear resurfaces at first obstacle. Moses stands before sea and army, past and threat. The staff once used before Pharaoh is lifted over waters. The sea parts, pathway emerges where none existed. Israel crosses on dry ground. Egypt's chariots follow, only to be swallowed as waters return. The covenant that survived famine now survives empire. On the far shore, song erupts. Miriam leads with tambourine. Celebration fills the air. But wilderness lies ahead. Deliverance from slavery does not equal immediate inheritance of promise. Between Egypt and Canaan stands desert testing ground, refining furnace. It reveals a crucial progression. Promise preserved through Joseph now transitions into promise liberated through Moses. God's timing stretched across centuries. Silence endured under bondage. Yet when the appointed moment arrived, deliverance unfolded with unmistakable power. The God who asked Abraham for everything, who wrestled Jacob into new identity, who elevated Joseph through injustice, now reveals himself as Redeemer of a people. The covenant is no longer confined to family narrative. It has become national destiny. But liberation is only the beginning. Freedom requires formation, and the wilderness will expose what Egypt could not erase. The story continues forward into law, rebellion, covenant renewed at Sinai, and a generation that will struggle to believe that the God who split the sea can also sustain them in scarcity. The promise moves, sometimes slowly, sometimes dramatically, but always forward. The wilderness did not greet Israel with applause. On the far side of the Red Sea, tambourines still echoed when thirst began to rise. 3 days into the desert, the people found water only to discover it was bitter. The place was named Merah. Celebration dissolved into complaint with unsettling speed. Deliverance had been miraculous, but daily survival felt uncertain. The God who split seas now seemed silent before undrinkable water. Moses cried out, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Thrown into the waters, bitterness turned sweet. It was a small miracle compared to the sea. No walls of water, no armies drowned, just wood and transformation. Yet its symbolism lingered. What is bitter can be healed. What seems undrinkable can sustain life when touched by divine instruction. Soon, hunger followed thirst. The wilderness exposed appetites Egypt had numbed but not erased. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, they murmured, remembering pots of meat and bread to the full. Slavery, in retrospect, appeared comfortable. Bondage has a way of romanticizing itself when freedom demands trust. Again, God responded not with immediate judgment, but provision. Manna appeared with a dew, delicate and strange, like coriander seed. What is it? They asked. The question became its name. Every morning, enough for the day. No hoarding, no accumulation for security except, before Sabbath, when double would be given, dependence became daily discipline. Quail arrived in the evening, bread from heaven in the morning. The wilderness became classroom. The lesson was not survival alone, but trust measured in 24-hour intervals. Egypt had offered predictable rations under oppression. The desert offered unpredictable grace under covenant. Still, complaints surfaced repeatedly. At Rephidim, water was absent altogether. The people quarreled, testing the Lord. Is the Lord among us or not? It is a haunting question. After plagues, after sea, after manna, presence was still doubted when circumstances tightened. Moses struck the rock at Horeb as commanded. Water flowed. A rock split open to sustain a stubborn people. Provision followed protest once again. Then Amalek attacked. For the first time since leaving Egypt, Israel faced organized violence in freedom. Moses stood on the hill with the staff of God in his hand. As long as his hands were raised, Israel prevailed. When they lowered, Amalek gained ground. Aaron and Hur supported his arms until sunset. Victory came not merely by sword, but through sustained intercession. The wilderness revealed that freedom required cooperation. Leaders upheld, burdens shared, isolation would fracture them. Covenant community demanded shared strength. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, soon observed another weakness. Leadership bottlenecked through one exhausted man. From morning until evening, Moses judged disputes alone. Jethro warned him, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out." Delegation followed. Structure emerged, authority distributed. Spiritual destiny required administrative wisdom. Then they arrived at Sinai. The mountain trembled, thunder rolled, lightning split sky. A thick cloud descended, and a trumpet blast grew louder and louder. Israel stood at the foot of a mountain that burned with fire. The God who had walked with Abraham under starlight now descended in visible glory before an entire nation. "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples." The promise widened again. What began as family oath became national vocation. Israel would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Mediation between heaven and earth was not restricted to Moses alone. It was woven into their identity. The 10 words followed commandments etched in stone. No other gods, no graven images, honor his name, remember the Sabbath, honor father and mother. Do not murder, commit adultery, steal, bear false witness, or covet. Law was not arbitrary control. It was relational architecture. After redemption came instruction. Freedom without formation would collapse into chaos. The law defined how liberated people live in proximity to holiness. The people trembled, begging Moses to mediate. You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. The fear was understandable. Sinai was overwhelming, yet distance carried risk. They desired safety more than intimacy. Moses entered the cloud. On the mountain, patterns for tabernacle and priesthood were revealed: measurements, fabrics, altars, garments. Detailed instruction filled chapters. To modern readers it may seem excessive, but every thread and dimension declared something radical. The Holy One intended to dwell in their midst. The God who spoke from fire would inhabit a tent among them. But revelation on the mountain coincided with impatience below. When Moses delayed days, stretching without visible return, anxiety fermented. Up, make us gods who shall go before us, the people urged Aaron. The request exposed a fracture. The God who split the sea had become too invisible, too unmanageable. They wanted tangible certainty. Gold was gathered, a calf fashioned. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. The speed of their forgetfulness stunned heaven and history alike. At Sinai's base, while covenant tablets were being carved, idolatry was being cast. It was not atheism, it was distortion. They did not deny deliverance, they reassigned it. The calf became visible substitute for unseen glory. God informed Moses. Judgment loomed. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them. Yet Moses interceded fiercely, appealing to God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He argued not from Israel's merit, but from God's covenant reputation among nations. A shepherd stood between a holy God and a rebellious people. Descending the mountain, Moses shattered the tablets in anger. The calf was burned, ground to powder, scattered on water, and made to be drunk. Consequences followed. Levites rallied, discipline enacted. The covenant had been broken almost as soon as it was formally given. Then comes one of the most poignant moments in the wilderness narrative. God declares he will send an angel before them, but will not personally go up in their midst, lest he consume them. It is a terrifying concession. Protection without presence. Moses refuses the compromise. If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. Land without presence is meaningless. Promise detached from God himself is hollow. The Lord responds with grace. My presence will go with you and I will give you rest. Covenant survives not because Israel proved faithful, but because God remained committed. Moses asks for more. Please, show me your glory. Hidden in the cleft of a rock, he witnesses a passing revelation. The Lord proclaims his own name, the Lord a God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. This declaration becomes theological cornerstone for generations. Justice and mercy intertwined, holiness and compassion inseparable. New tablets were carved, the covenant renewed, the tabernacle constructed according to heavenly pattern. When completed, a cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So intense was the presence that even Moses could not enter when the cloud settled. From Sinai onward, movement would be guided by that cloud, lifted when they were to journey, resting when they were to camp. No longer enslaved to Pharaoh's command, they now marched under divine direction. Yet the wilderness was far from finished. Complaints would return. Spies would falter. A generation would wander for 40 years because fear outpaced faith. Even Moses would fail at Meribah, striking rock in frustration and forfeiting entry into the land. Part 8 exposes a tension deeper than hunger or thirst. It reveals the human heart struggling to live in sustained freedom. Miracles can initiate liberation. Obedience must sustain it. Sinai offered intimacy and instruction, but idolatry lurked beneath impatience. The God who descended in fire desired proximity, yet proximity required transformation. The covenant people stood between promise and possession, redeemed from Egypt, not yet resting in Canaan. The wilderness was neither punishment alone nor mere delay. It was purification, exposure, refinement. God's faithfulness did not evaporate when theirs wavered. Presence remained a defining gift. The question echoing through sand and centuries was no longer, can God deliver? The sea had answered that. The deeper question became, will we trust the God who stays? Freedom felt different than they imagined. The sea was behind them, Egypt's chariots silenced beneath waves. Tambourines still echoing in memory, yet the wilderness did not immediately resemble promise. Sand stretched farther than certainty. The pillar of cloud moved ahead, but manna had not yet fallen. Water had not yet flowed from rock. Liberation had occurred in a night. Transformation would unfold across years. 3 days into the desert, thirst replaced song. They found water at Marah, but it was bitter. Celebration evaporated quickly when expectation met disappointment. The people grumbled against Moses. The pattern that would define an entire generation surfaced early. Miracle forgotten at the first sign of discomfort. Moses cried out, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, cast into the waters. Bitterness became sweet. It was not merely hydration, it was instruction. Freedom would expose what slavery had concealed. Egypt had fed them predictably, though harshly. The wilderness demanded trust daily. Soon hunger followed thirst. Would that we had died in Egypt, they murmured, nostalgia rewriting oppression into comfort. Memory can romanticize bondage when freedom requires faith. Then manna appeared with the morning dew. Fine, flake-like, mysterious. What is it, they asked. The question became its name. Each day they were to gather only enough for that day. Hoarding produced rot. Dependence could not be stockpiled, except on the sixth day double provision for Sabbath rest. The rhythm of heaven interrupted the urgency of survival. Even in wilderness, rest was commanded. Freedom was not endless labor. It was ordered trust. Quail arrived in the evening, bread in the morning, flesh at dusk. Sustenance fell where plows could not reach. The God who split seas now sustained stomachs. Still they tested him. At Rephidim no water appeared at all. Is the Lord among us or not? They demanded. It is a haunting question, especially after plagues and parted waters. Presence was doubted not because of absence of evidence, but because of discomfort in the present. God commanded Moses to strike the rock at Horeb. Water flowed abundantly. Provision continued, but so did the deeper issue and belief beneath miracles. Then Amalek attacked. Freshly freed slaves now faced organized violence. Moses stood on the hill with the staff of God. As long as his hands were raised, Israel prevailed. When they fell, Amalek advanced. Aaron and Hur supported his arms until sunset. Victory required shared strength. Freedom was communal, not individual. Leaders needed support. Covenant required cooperation. At Sinai, the story ascended into thunder. The mountain burned, lightning fractured sky, a trumpet blast intensified. The people trembled at the foot of divine fire. The God who spoke to Abraham privately now addressed a nation collectively. If you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Identity expanded. They were not merely liberated slaves. They were called mediators between heaven and earth. The 10 words followed commands etched in stone. No other gods, no idols, honor the name, remember the Sabbath, honor parents, guard life, marriage, truth, contentment. Law was not restriction of joy but framework of relationship. Redemption preceded regulation. God did not command them into freedom, he freed them into command. The people, overwhelmed, begged Moses to mediate. Do not let God speak to us directly. Proximity frightened them. Holiness exposed. Moses entered the cloud. On the mountain, instructions were given for tabernacle, priesthood, sacrifice intricate, detailed, deliberate. The Holy One intended to dwell among them, not distant, not abstract, present, but below the mountain. Impatience fermented. When Moses delayed, anxiety ignited idolatry. Make us gods who shall go before us, they told Aaron. Gold was melted, a calf was formed. They attributed deliverance to an image fashioned by their own hands. Idolatry was not atheism, it was misrepresentation. They did not deny Exodus. They reassigned glory. God informed Moses. Judgment threatened annihilation. But Moses interceded, appealing to covenant promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He stood between wrath and rebellion. Descending, he shattered the tablets in righteous anger. Covenant broken before it was fully received. Consequences followed. Discipline, mourning, distance. Then came a terrifying declaration. God would send an angel, but he himself would not go in their midst. Protection without presence. Moses refused to compromise. If your presence will not go with us, do not bring us up from here. Land without God was emptiness. Promise detached from presence was hollow. The Lord relented. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Moses asked for more. Show me your glory. Hidden in the cleft of rock. He encountered a revelation that would define Israel's theology for generations. The Lord, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, holiness and mercy intertwined. New tablets were carved, covenant renewed, the tabernacle constructed. When completed, the glory of the Lord filled it so powerfully that even Moses could not enter. A cloud covered the tent by day, fire within it by night. They would move when the cloud lifted. They would camp when it settled. Guidance became visible, yet wilderness wandering stretched longer than expected. Spies sent into QAnon returned divided to confident, 10 fearful. The people believed fear. They refused to enter. Unbelief delayed inheritance by 40 years. An entire generation would fall in desert sand. Even Moses faltered at Meribah, striking the rock in frustration rather than speaking as commanded. Leadership fatigue left its mark. Because of this, he too would see the land from distance but not enter. Freedom did not erase human frailty. Still, God remained faithful. Their clothes did not wear out. Manna continued. The pillar did not vanish. As the 40th year closed, a new generation stood poised at the edge of promise. Moses gathered them and rehearsed the law once more. Remember, do not forget, when you prosper, do not say, my power has gotten me this wealth. Teach your children, bind these words to your hearts. Covenant required memory. From Mount Nebo, Moses viewed Canaan, the land promised to Abraham, the land Jacob longed for, the land Joseph believed in enough to request his bones be carried there. Moses died within sight of fulfillment. Joshua would lead the crossing of another river, the Jordan, into territory long pledged but not yet possessed. closes not with completion but with continuity. From Abraham's altar to Jacob's wrestling, from Joseph's prison to Moses' mountain, the promise advanced through delay, betrayal, famine, slavery, rebellion, renewal. God's faithfulness outlasted human instability. The covenant was never sustained by perfect people. It was carried by persistent grace. A coffin once rested in Egypt as quiet testimony that exile was not destiny. Soon those bones would be buried in promised soil. The story does not end in wilderness. It moves forward into conquest, kings, prophets, exile again, and whispers of a greater deliverer who would embody law, fulfill sacrifice, and lead a final exodus not from empire but from sin itself. Promise endured, presence remained, and the God who called Abraham under stars continued guiding history toward a fulfillment larger than any single generation could see.